Greetings. Welcome to week 2. I hope last week went well for you. I was very happy to read your writing, read the responses, and I really enjoyed what you had to say. I thought there were some really good insights that I don't know, maybe wouldn't have come out if you were just sitting in a course and saying those insights. What do you think about that? Would you have said all that in class? Maybe not. Anyway, regardless, keep doing it. That was it was excellent. So we've got sort of a transition week this week. We move our fabulous little colonists out of the early colonial period and into the 1700s, which is a time of turmoil and kind of a strange time. I did want to say just a few more things about these early peoples before we move them on and get them closer to becoming Benjamin Franklin and whoever they do become in the 1700s. Before that, though, just a couple of things to remember. When we're talking about these British colonists, one thing is they've been called superstitious by some, and that is not accurate. They were not what we would call superstitious because of what that implies. I think we need to understand that the way that these colonists saw their world was quite different from the way that we might see our world. So if I head out, there's a window there, I promise. If I head out into the trees outside of that window and walk around amongst the squirrels and trees and plants and all of that, I'm going to assume that I'm not going to be attacked by a goblin or a ghost, or that I'm not going to see a demon. I mean, I hope I don't see a demon. But these early Americans, these colonists, had what we might call a pre-scientific mindset. They would simply assume if you go out into the forest, I'm at Cal State, it's not a forest, but you know what I mean. If you go out into a forest, you can assume that you're going to see some evil creatures out there. It's almost like they all lived at Hogwarts or something, and then that they're heading off into that dark and scary forest. And they would write about this stuff as if giant spiders existed, and as if ghosts and goblins and ghouls were on the prowl, and basically the devil is in their midst and is always after them. This is something that is not just a superstitious people. These are people who believe that their world, their everyday existence, is teeming with magic and is rife with the stuff. And it's not just a way of seeing their world and nature, but it's even a way of seeing science for them. So I think a good example of that is a remedy that they would use at that time for a fever. So if you have a high fever, what do you do? It looked like there was an earthquake because I bumped the table, but there wasn't an earthquake. It was just the table. Sorry about that. But if you have a fever, I assume you take Advil or Tylenol or something. If it gets really bad, you might take a bath, put some ice on yourself, go to urgent care. I don't know. If they have a fever, here's what one medical remedy said in 1614. It was a Puritan medical remedy, and it was very clear. It was a doctor who wrote this in a journal. He's not just writing his diary. This is published in a medical journal of the day. He said, of late I've tried this cure with great success. So here's what you do. First off, you're going to cut your nails, and you save the clippings, and you put them in a fine linen sack, and you tie the sack, and then you get a bucket, and you get a stick, and put the sack with the nails in it tied to the bucket, so it's actually, or tied to the stick, so it's hanging in the bucket. Then, what are you going to do? No ideas? You're going to go get an eel, obviously, right? So you get an eel, you bring the eel back, you put the eel in the bucket, and you have to make sure that the nails are above the neck of the eel. You get the nails above the neck of the eel, let the eel die, and then the patient's fever will break. The patient's fever will get better. Now, what's the relationship between the fever, the nails, the eel, the bucket, any of this? There's not one that we would call scientific, right? We might say that the fever just happened to break and that the doctor thought that it was because of the eel and the nails and all of that, and who knows how he came up with this silliness, but and we could just, if you're taking a philosophy or a logic class, then we might say it's sort of post hoc ergo propter hoc thinking, right? It happens after the eel, nail, linen sack business, and therefore the doctor thinks it happens because of that. But for us, we would say it's sort of, it's not very scientific. It is not a scientific people that thinks that way. And that's something for us to remember. These are not a scientific people by any means. Our friend Ben Franklin will slightly change that. Did you notice how I have two? It even gets better. Look, I have three versions of it. There are many, many versions of that. We'll talk about that later. Franklin would push the country slightly more toward the sciences and toward a more scientific way of thinking, but not entirely. So it's good to remember that. The second thing I want you to know about these early colonists is their ideas of class distinction and how difficult it is for us to understand how they saw class. So for us, we tend to see class as just a function of income and maybe neighborhood or car that you drive or something like that. For them, it doesn't even come close to getting it. For them, class was such an inherent part of who you were. There would be no way for us to fit in really with any class at that time. There were such great distinctions of wealth. You've seen the lovely little wigs that the people wore in that day. So if you're in the 1600s or 1700s and you're walking around Britain, you might see someone with a wig and you would immediately know his class. If you're a worker, so if you're in the working class, you could work your entire life and add up all your wages, and all of those wages together would not equal the price of that one wig that person's wearing. His wig costs more than you as a laborer, as a working class person, could make in your entire career. Bummer, right? That sort of class distinction, that idea of class distinction and fixed distinction, it's something that's hard for us to understand. It's easier to understand if you're on the East Coast, but especially out here in California. It's not the type of class that we have out here. It's a different class system, and it's important to realize that when English people consider themselves in their world, they see themselves as a classed people. So they would know exactly their ranking in that hierarchy. And it's a ranking that couldn't really change either. It's fixed. So the Americas will start to change that, make that more fluid. But it's important to realize that these Americans come from that class system. As we move into the 1700s, though, these American colonies start to change. We've got this lovely graphic that will show you that the colonies here really are starting to prosper. So hopefully you can see that. By 1710, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, they are starting to prosper. They're starting to grow. Really, their numbers are on the increase. And their economies are absolutely flourishing. So there's stability in these colonies. They're starting to prosper. But one of the things that starts to change them is that their labor system is changing. So one thing you're going to listen to this week, or perhaps read about this week, is indentured servitude. And you might think, why do they not stay with indentured servitude? Why do these colonies head from indentured servitude toward chattel slavery? Because they've really got three options. So if you're considering labor, you've got three options in the colonies that they could have chosen. Free labor, just we are a wage labor people. They could have used temporary servitude, which they did for quite some time. Or they could have used slavery. So why is it that they end up with slavery? Obviously, race has something to do with it. The need has something to do with it, the fact that they have great labor shortages. But race is not, race and need, it's not the only thing that plays in here. So what we need to realize is that this racial slavery system that develops over the 1600s and into the 1700s was never inevitable. It was always made out of choices and laws that people had in that time. So So it's actually in Massachusetts, which is the first colony to legally recognize slavery in 1641, followed by Virginia in 1662. But it's in Virginia where we see laws start to change, which make slavery perpetual, which say that, unlike the rest of English law, the status of the child will be dependent on the status of the mother, so not the status of the father. So children born in slavery, it's not relevant who the father is. And think about that for a while. That the children born into slavery would be slaves or not based on their mother. So if you're born of a slave, you are a slave, period. So slowly this system changes in Virginia. We have one case, a very important case in the mid-1600s, where 3 runaway slaves run off of the plantation. 3 runaway indentured servants. 3 servants run off. 2 of them are white, 1 is black. The 2 white servants get 1 year added to their labor once they're caught. The 1 black servant is made a servant for life, which sounds like what? Exactly. It sounds like slavery. So the law itself slowly changes to consider race as a more important factor than anything else. Their labor shortage, coupled with their beliefs about race and their beliefs about the inferiority of certain races, those together, that's what produces the slave system that we see. So remember that as we start to read or do these readings this week. Remember that this system of slavery, it's different in each colony, but it is something that is born out of beliefs of race, out of economic systems, out of political systems, and out of the experience of these hundreds of millions of people who will be brought over against their will from Africa to be a part of this strange new system. So with that, I send you off to do some reading on labor. I would, and then also on this week, I believe you're also going to read on the French and Indian War. You're going to see how the French and Indian War starts to become a mid-century challenge that pushes the colonists slightly away from the mother country. And then I also want you to start reading Benjamin Franklin this week. There's no need to read the whole thing this week, but just start into the first part of the book. It's broken into 3 parts. And remember, this is not a reading that you need to focus so heavily on that you read absolutely every word. Remember that this is a tough read. It's hard to get into that type of language, into that sort of 18th century vernacular, but it's fruitful. So we're going to focus on that next week. This week I would just have you start to read it, start to get into it, and start to love the man who was Benjamin Franklin. That was probably overboard. You don't have to love him, but just enjoy the reading, enjoy the other video, and look forward to seeing your fabulous comments online again this week.